Hi, this is Bob Whitaker. Welcome to History Respawned. Today's episode features a video version of our podcast episode on Red Dead Redemption 2, which was recorded in December 2018. I decided to convert this into a video episode because I've got some virus-induced time on my hands, and because I've got a lot of Red Dead Redemption 2 footage recorded. As you know, Red Dead Redemption 2 follows the exploits of Arthur Morgan and the Vanderlyn Gang in 1899 America. Like the first Red Dead Redemption, Red Dead 2 includes action sequences and settings drawn from classic Hollywood westerns. But unlike the first Red Dead, this game also attempts to establish a more authentic feel with the game mechanics, as well as tackle more serious subject matters and themes in the narrative. My guest on this episode was Dr. Esther Wright, who is a visiting lecturer in media arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her research considers the representation of 20th century American history by Rockstar Games, in particular the Red Dead series and LA Noire. In addition to studying how these games adapt American history, Esther also investigates the promotional techniques Rockstar uses to sell the historical authenticity of these titles. A word of warning: my discussion with Esther goes into spoilers for the game. I can't imagine that's a huge deal now that we're 2 years on from the release of the game, but just in case, you've been warned. With that intro out of the way, here's the episode. Esther, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for joining me. So given your research on this topic and Rockstar Games more generally, what do you make of this new game, Red Dead Redemption 2? And in particular, how do you think it compares to Rockstar's other historical games?
So, I think there's a couple of things that we could sort of broadly talk about. I think for one, the tone of the game, it was very recognizable, obviously, as a Rockstar game. But from the beginning, I was expecting this opening sequence, so these opening cutscenes that sort of really like set the scene and did kind of humorous things, or told us things about this world in the way that Red Dead 1 and LA Noire and GTA, it's kind of these games are known for that. But the opening sequences, they were just really sort of like somber and really sad, and it sort of set up this game that felt just kind of like it had this sort of sincerity to it. It felt less sarcastic than a lot of Rockstar games, and there were moments in certain missions where this completely broke down and sort of like Rockstar's hand broke through, and you were like, oh, okay, I see this now. And there were some genuinely funny missions that I was surprised kind of entertained me as much as they did, and felt like you were playing a Grand Theft Auto game. Like, I can't remember the name of it, but the one where you take Lenny into, I think it's Valentine, and you get drunk in the saloon.
Oh. That's great, partner. Lenny, where are you? Hey, Lenny! Lenny? See that fella I was with? Sorry, I don't know. Lenny, where are you? Lenny!
Just like, still, it's one of those standout missions to me that was like, oh yeah, this just feels so classically Rockstar. And it was doing something completely abstract and away from this big historicizing thing. It was just this moment that you were supposed to enjoy, I think. But yeah, it had this kind of deep sadness that I felt Red Dead Redemption 1 didn't have. It had this kind of snark that even though it was trying to grapple with these big things like the death of the West and then the passing of the outlaws, it was still very kind of jokey, or
tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah. What I also felt was this game, it felt as though they were sort of showing rather than telling, if that makes sense.
Yes.
there were a lot of instances in Red Dead 1 specifically, and in most of their games, where you'd be having conversations with characters that were really sort of on the nose about historical events. Like I'm thinking in Red Dead 1 of Drew McFarlane, or where he's just talking about like these big things that have happened, and it was just telling you about history and how they got here. And there's moments of that in this game, like certainly, and you got the typical Rockstar thing of doing all this historicizing while you're riding and moving from place to place and having conversations, but things feel much more kind of abstract and unspoken. And I think it's a positive and a negative. It sort of allows it to kind of build the sense of this world and where it is historically, but I think there are specific consequences to doing that and it all being a bit more abstract.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about Red Dead 1 that makes Red Dead 2 feel so strange is the fact that Red Dead 1 is so obviously kind of a piece of genre fiction, right? It is really leaning heavily into spaghetti westerns. It's leaning really heavily into Peck and Paw's The Wild Bunch. Whereas this game seems to have a little bit more distance away from those kind of cinema inspirations. And I was wondering, did you get that sense at all? I mean, do you feel like this game is kind of leaning into American cinema in the same way that Red Dead 1 or L.A. Noire did in the past?
Yeah, it didn't, there were moments, like I think there's one mission, and I'm sure it's almost identical to like one of the scenes in the assassination of Jesse James. But so, there's obviously moments and you can't get away from that because it's the Western, right? But it did feel, I've been trying to, this is something I've been thinking about actually, and I've been trying to put it into words. I think with Red Dead 1, there was more at stake in terms of selling a Western game because they hadn't really been, they've been pervasive, but they hadn't been as like blockbuster successful as Red Dead 1 was.
Right.
And something that I look at in my thesis actually is the way that on the Rockstar Newswire, one of the things that Rockstar did to sell Red Dead 1 was they kind of curated this series of recommendations of films to watch, and they all sort of really thematically linked up specifically to different things that Red Dead was doing. So brutality, masculinity, all these kind of things. But I feel like with Red Dead 2, I think there's less at stake. And they've sort of won themselves essentially the authority to tell a story about America's West that is obviously still positioned in the Western, but doesn't have to lean into being strictly genre fiction so much, which I think is really interesting and really kind of, there's a lot at stake with that. The fact that they are now seen as having the authority to tell their story. But I think, as you said, the fact that so much of the substance for this franchise is drawn out of, Peckinpah and, Clint Eastwood and Leone, is that, revisionist sort of brutality and violence are its cornerstones, and their historical awareness and cultural awareness comes from a very particular period in Westerns, and the legacy of that can still be felt in this game. It's kind of enshrined. So it means that they're channeling an image of the Western that's essentially crystallized around white masculinity, and it leads to this kind of complete marginalization or othering of anyone who doesn't fit into the image of hardened male outlaw, which, is a problem or, a thing across Rockstar Games. This is the kind of the character they feel comfortable writing, but it has a special sort of relevance for the Western.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely dead on there. I think you're right in saying that it almost feels as though the Housers don't need to rely on cinema so much, but at the same time, like you said, they are still kind of carrying over a lot of these themes and hallmarks from Western cinema from, the 1960s, 1970s, which, for anybody who studies it knows that, that cinema is really obsessed with the Vietnam War. And so a lot of those themes and ideas, for scholars, for cultural critics, it feels very, very old and very, very out of place.
Yeah.
I think you look at kind of more recent Westerns, they've kind of moved past a lot of those things. You've got a lot more female heroines, for instance, in Westerns now than you used to. And there's a lot more place for people of color in Westerns, which definitely wasn't always the case, but I'm not sure how much Rockstar has kind of moved along with the times in that regard.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
So speaking of those topics, this new Rockstar game attempts to deal with more serious topics in American history, including women's suffrage, racism, and native rights. How well do you think they've done in these respects in Red Dead Redemption 2?
I mean, do you want to just go through them in turn and just sort of talk about them?
Whatever you want to do.
I
I'll
mean,
line them up and you can knock them down.
well, yeah, I mean, it's funny because, you know, I have this sort of quite big section in my research that is looking specifically at these kinds of things. And because I have this specific focus on promotion, I was kind of looking up until the release of this game as to what kind of image we were given and what it then eventually delivers in the game itself. And especially with women, I found this quite disappointing, or if not, you know, frustrating. Especially, I mean, this is stuff that I've been thinking about kind of recently, especially with the women in the camp. Because, you know, of all the women you get, they are, I mean, probably the most developed. And especially these characters that you sort of knew were going to be in it. Like, I'm thinking of Abigail, and, you know, she's around camp all the time. And I really wanted to have conversations with her. I wanted to, you know, get to know her away from being like Abigail Marston in this, you know, in Red Dead 1. But she seems to basically have two gears, which are being worried or annoyed about Jack or worried or annoyed about John. And that's like the extent of the interactions you can have with her, like, oh, how are you doing? Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, I'll leave you to it then. I find that really frustrating, you know, considering that all these women, you know, were kind of, when you had the sort of the promotional images of them to introduce who the gang were, who this kind of family unit was, they were all sort of like really hardened and really, you know, rough and ready and ready for action. I don't think what was kind of sold is really what you get. And I think this is especially obvious with Sadie Adler's character.
Yes.
When, you know, I was like, okay, I'm getting into the game now, right? Where's Sadie? I want to talk to Sadie. And the first thing you have to do is you have to rescue her. I mean, it's frustrating when, you know, all the kind of male outlaws come kind of fully packaged and they're all ready to go and they're already outlaws and they don't need any explanation. She has to go through this kind of like trauma, and it has to all be about her husband and revenging him.
And presumably her rape as well. That's not explicitly stated, but we can assume that from the opening sequences.
Yeah, it's just these very well-worn tropes. And yeah, I mean, the whole aspect of trying to engage in these more serious topics like suffrage, I think, I mean, yeah, it's a nice, I suppose, gesture, considering that, you know, in the first game there was almost nothing other than that, you know, silent movie, which was talking about how, like, you know, don't turn Uncle Sam into Aunt Samantha or whatever it was, you know, but like how women getting the vote would emasculate all men. But, you know, the mission where, you know, I'm thinking of the one where Arthur has to drive the wagon full of suffragettes into roads, I think it is, and protect them. You know, it's you do it because you're trying to protect one of the sons of the family, one of the big families, you know, his girlfriend. And then as soon as you kind of have a listen to what the lead suffragette is saying, you sort of go and like have a fight around the corner, and it's just this sort of bit of historical texture and background noise. And I think what I guess is telling is I've sort of been thinking about the legacy of, you know, the dastardly achievement in Red Dead Redemption 1, and the whole thing about the YouTube video recently. Where,
and just a reminder, the dastardly achievement is where you tie up a woman and then throw her on the train tracks to get run over. Yeah,
you know, it was almost, I guess, almost baiting people to try and do the same thing. And the fact that that was a secret achievement, you know, they didn't tell people they needed to do that. It was just, if you do it, this is what will happen. But yeah, the whole YouTube controversy recently about the guy who in Saint Denis, one of the suffragettes, and, you know, beating up this like annoying feminist. And there were videos of, you know, the players feeding her to like alligators, and it's just, it's kind of put there. And, you know, I guess, done in a way so they can say, look, we tried to, we really tried to, get this broad sweep of representation of these things that were going on. And yeah, that's true, but you don't prevent anyone from basically just rubbishing it. Because it's all up for grabs. It's all fair game. And I think just in general, like, I played this game. It took me a long time to kind of get to the end, but I played it quite rapidly. I kept getting distracted all the time by different things, different side missions and stranger missions. But in doing so, I felt as though I felt at the bare minimum about a lot of these characters and about the women who I did meet, whether that was optional or not. I sort of felt a bit disappointed. And I guess that left me feeling that interacting with women beyond kind of a surface level, or finding out anything more deeply about how they feel and their experiences, is essentially up to the player. Like, it's optional. I don't know if you felt that too.
Definitely. I mean, and I totally agree with you that the missions involving the suffragettes seem rather throwaway, right? It's something that's kind of happening in the background, but not something you actively have to engage with or really think about. I think too, the kind of issues regarding racism at the time, a lot of that heavy lifting is done by characters in the camp like Lenny, and then also Charles. And Charles in particular really kind of stands out as this really attempt to diversify the cast, where they have somebody who is half African-American, half Native. He brings it up all the time. And it's not something that you as a player really have to think about. Otherwise, there might be some kind of tension there, especially within the gang, but there's not. And I think it's funny too that a lot of those instances in which Charles or Lenny talks about those issues come in the context of banter while you're riding to and from the camp. And so it's almost like a way to add something in to give the player something to do while they're riding around, because there is a lot of sequences in this game. It's a very deliberately paced game. There's a lot of sequences in which you are kind of out there riding with nothing to do. So I almost saw those as more of an attempt to kind of entertain the player a bit rather than engaging with those sorts of topics.
I just heard some of the army out here was particularly unpleasant about it.
Unpleasant? How do you rob and kill people pleasantly? We don't. In spite of Dutch's talk.
I fear I was perhaps trying to simplify something more complicated for the benefit of our block-headed driver here.
Hey, don't blame it on me. Never forget, this here's a con man, Charles, born and bred. Just 'cause it sounds fancy don't mean he knows a damn thing about what he's talking about. So, what happened to your tribe?
I don't even know if I have one. At least, not that I can remember. My father was a colored man. He told me he lived with our people for a while. A number of free men did, but when we were forced to move from our lands, the three of us fled. I was too young to really remember much. My whole life I've been on the run.
A couple years later, some soldiers captured my mother. Took her somewhere. We never saw her again. We drifted around. He was a very sad man, and the drink had a mean hold on him. Around 13, I just took off on my own.
That was about the age we found young Arthur here. Maybe a little older. A wilder delinquent you never did see. But he learned fast.
Yeah, it does have a tendency to feel very, very throwaway in that sense. No, and I completely agree. And it's interesting because in my notes I'd written, I essentially kind of put Charles and Lenny in the same bracket, where you have this one major character that has to represent an entire history of white supremacy and oppression, which is it's exactly the same as in Red Dead 1, where you have like Nastas, who is basically the only Native American character you have any kind of like interaction with, and I think obviously it's a positive that this game finally acknowledges Black Americans as part of the West, because Red Dead 1 completely, which I never really understood with Red Dead 1, because Red Dead Revolver had admittedly, he's nameless, the Buffalo Soldier as a playable protagonist. So they're obviously aware of these kind of, complex kind of historical, people existing. But and yeah, it does really just fall on Lenny and to an extent Tilly, but
Yes.
not really. She is just completely sort of confined to having like one mission that revolves around her,
And she seems otherwise to just sit there and play dominoes in camp,
yeah,
and that's it.
yeah. I mean, I like the fact, and I say like as sort of, yeah, I guess I liked it. When you're I'm trying to be nice,
I understand.
When you're walking through camp, I think when you get sort of to, oh god, the Shady Belle and the one before, which is, I've completely forgotten, I think sort of chapter 3.
On the creek.
Yeah.
What's that called?
Oh,
I don't remember that camp name. We'll cut this out.
Yeah. The ones basically as they're moving further and further southeast. It's interesting that Tilly and Lenny are visibly, or they'll talk to you and they'll say they're uncomfortable the further south you go, which I think is an interesting kind of ambient touch, but again, is completely unexplored and is very abstract. And again, Lenny has some conversations with you about, being the first one, I think, in his family to be free. And you get some sort of characterization from him. But, again, the burden of representation is placed on like this one character who has to conform and fit into the story Rockstar wanted to tell about white male outlaws. And I think the way that they deal with the sort of the legacy of slavery is interesting. So I'm thinking specifically, like I wrote down in my notes, the Stranger Mission, the Iniquities of History with Jeremiah Compson, the guy who you find, sleeping on a bench outside a train station, and he complains that I think like the government took his home and he's, completely destitute, and he sort of begs you to go and get his most treasured possessions on his kind of foreclosed house. And I think, you're supposed to feel sorry for him. You're supposed to be like, oh, he's another broken, dispossessed man. He's a man out of his time, like Arthur and Dutch. And then you get to his house and you find out that he kind of, his pride and his sense of like, his life comes from the fact that he was a slave catcher.
Yes.
And then, you sort of go to confront him and he, it's revealed that he's this disgruntled post-Civil War Southerner. And even though, obviously Arthur takes the moral high ground and is like, some jobs aren't worth saving, and burns his, ledger of captured slaves, this guy is like crying, saying, this is my history. I still exist. So I don't know how I feel about this mission. And I suspect that's the point. I think you were supposed to feel kind of ambiguous about it because they set him up as this another guy who's being dispossessed by the government. And although the fact that, you put the player in the right for burning the book and you get honor, I think, for killing him, it's this kind of convenient moral disengagement that he's this, this slave catcher and he's this relic of, a time that is, well past. But it never actually mentions slavery explicitly, as far as I can tell. And it's up to the player whether they recognize when you look at the ledger what it means and its wider ramifications. It talks about the Black people being recaptured and obviously refers to them as property in that sense. But if you weren't aware, I'm not trying to say that the player is stupid, but it's trying to kind of put so much complexity and so many issues into just this one kind of, again, optional stranger mission.
It's one of those moments where they kind of put on some historical window dressing to make this mission seem much more interesting, to kind of give you a gotcha moment, but not really kind of diving deeper into those historical topics.
Oh man, you show some respect. I was respected once. I had a profession.
You asked me to get you something.
There's no bringing back what I want. I want my job, my pride, the respect accorded to a gentleman.
What about this old crap? Huh?
My things. Don't you understand? Those bastards, they changed everything. I was a good worker. I took pride in my work. They took it away. Pissed on my legacy.
Old man, some jobs ain't for saving. And some legacies,
Oh,
they are for pissing
what
on.
are you doing? That's my history. Ah! Damn you! Damn you! I still exist.
Yeah, and it's setting up these sort of morally ambiguous situations, and they're usually quite distasteful. But they leave it up to you to kind of infer or understand what you want from it,
Hmm.
and that's part of the problem that I have. Is that kind of ambiguity often just doesn't pay off, and it's like an inside
Yes.
joke. They're obviously demonstrating that, oh yes, we know this, we understand this. This is, look at how smart we are, but actually it means that they don't actually comment on it in a really
Hmm.
meaningful way.
I think
Yeah,
there are these instances of that I'm sure you ran into where you encounter on the side of the road members of the Ku Klux Klan
yeah,
attempting to hold rallies, and there's
mm,
at least a couple of these instances that I ran into in which one where they are having an initiation, burning a
mm,
cross, they end up setting fire to themselves accidentally, and you
yeah,
also gain honor from killing them in that
yeah,
instance as well. And then also a later instance in which they three of them are attempting to raise a cross
mm,
outside of a city, and the cross actually falls down on top of them, killing them. Now, what's interesting about this is that obviously the Ku Klux Klan is bad, evil, right? You see people in white hoods, you kill them, you gain honor, right? The kind of message there is obvious, but the historical context is really much more interesting because, in places like, Louisiana, this kind of stand-in for Louisiana that you see in the game,
mm,
the Klan didn't need to wear hoods, right?
mm,
The kind of express segregation, the kind of express denial of black rights that was instigated in the South meant that the police officers, right, the local officials were essentially doing the work of the Klan, and there wasn't a need to dress up in hoods. There wasn't a need
yeah,
to disguise who you were. And I wish that that kind of idea was included in the game because it gets that kind of historical nuance that you're kind of talking about that's missing
yeah,
from the game. It feels like there's more ambiguity there, and it wasn't quite as obvious to people at
yeah,
the time that oh yes, of
yeah,
course, Ku Klux Klan bad, right?
yeah. Yeah, it's presuming a certain kind of hindsight, um,
Yes.
but actually as well, something that I was thinking about in terms of these things specifically is I was thinking about Mafia 3, and
Yeah.
Adam Chapman and I have done kind of some work on this. We're kind of in the middle of writing this, big thing, or not big thing, an article on Mafia 3, and it's something that we sort of talked about with that, how essentially it reduces these kind of historical, institutional, sort of structural issues down to interpersonal conflicts.
Hmm.
So you take like several really bad Civil War losers, or kind of individual racists, or a couple of like inept, KKK people versus, Lenny, or one bad army general against all the Native Americans. And it makes it hard to kind of like mount this sustained acknowledgement or critique against what is basically a history of institutionalized systemic racism against people
Hmm.
who are not white. And these are not closed
Hmm.
issues. These are not things that just happened in the past. They're still ongoing, as we know. So I think this is a problem that is found across historical video games when they try and deal with these kind of serious topics.
Hmm.
It does end up reducing it all to conflict between individuals rather than something that was perpetuated by government policy.
And I would say that there is an instance in this game where you do get a sense of the negative aspects of government policy, and that's with regards to native rights. This kind of an extended part that, say, the last quarter of the game, in which
Mm,
you're engaging with Rainfall's and his son and attempting
mm,
to kind of establish some sort of rights, some sort of space for natives in kind of the northern part of the map, and in particular facing kind of strong resistance from U.S. government forces. I'm wondering, what did you make of those attempts to engage with kind of issues of native rights in the past?
I mean, when I started the game, because I think because I knew where it was going in terms of, I knew that the end point would presumably have to be Dutch joining, the Native Americans,
Right.
because obviously that's where it kicks off in Motive One. I was kind of like not waiting to be disappointed, but I was like, okay, how are they gonna negotiate this?
Mm.
Are they gonna really try and do something a bit that unpacks it a bit more. And then literally I think it's the first mission, sorry, the last mission of the first chapter, when you're driving from the cabins that they end up in to Horseshoe Overlook. And you get that moment where the 3 Native Americans appear on horseback, and you get kind of like the panpipe music. And at that moment, I was like, oh God, just like, I mean, and you get Charles sits on the back of the wagon, and they sort of have a conversation. But Hosea, talks about how badly they've been treated in the area, and Charles is like, oh, is that any different from the way that they've been treated anywhere? And he's sort of like, no, and he says something like, I feel like I may be trying to simplify something more complex for our, essentially for our idiot driver, for Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really strange or interesting way of getting into talking about these things. Like, I didn't know, is that a comment directed towards like the player? Is that a comment directed towards white people? Is it basically Rockstar signaling their wokeness, like they know that these are really complex things? But then you sort of get nothing, or almost nothing, other than the interactions you have with Charles until the party where you go to Angela Bronte's house in maybe chapter 4, I think.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and you're sort of there on the balcony, and Bronte, who's this Italian American, is basically saying that, I think it's Rains Ball who's there saying, oh, the idiots, how can you be so stupid as to get duped by Americans and lose your land? And I was like, oh, okay, this is like one sort of minority kind of talking badly about another minority, but okay. And then Arthur sort of runs into Rains Fall and Eagle Flies in the street, even though I felt like I had played, and this is another problem that I have with this game, is that I felt I played Arthur so nicely the entire game. I was like the biggest goody two shoes in the West. And then in all of these cutscenes, he's so hard and so horrible to people sometimes. And that was this really like weird moment of cognitive dissonance. But when he meets Rainsfall and Eagle Flies, and he basically says, oh, I'm not helping you with that money. And you get Eagle Flies saying, oh, another mercenary or whatever, but I don't know. So when you get actually into the bit where you're doing things for the Native Americans, you are trying to sort of make gains for them and help them out and assist, and Arthur generally mellows over time and comes to believe that this is this kind of noble cause, obviously, because of course he does. I think it's tried to make something very complex fit into the sort of the way that Rockstar tells stories. The fact that you have to go and get the documents that prove that this big bad oil baron is trying to move the Native Americans because of oil and all that kind of thing. I mean, I think one of the slightly better things was the fact that you could actually go to the reservation in this game, which I always had a problem with in Red Dead 1, was the fact that the only time you get to go there is when you're going with the army to kill everyone. Yes. And I just think that was just, but I find it very convenient that I think it's Eagle Flies who sort of says that, oh, the army's already taken all the women and children, so basically what you're left with is sort of the old and infirm. It's this kind of, it's not a nice place, and I'm not saying that they should have depicted the reservation as a nice place, but it's like as if they've already vanished, like it's already a done thing, and it's this dying, decaying place. It really doesn't kind of give you any sense of life. Or maybe it does, but only in kind of the negative, the lost cause kind of way.
Yeah. And it doesn't really stand on its own. I mean, for my money, it seems as though the Native Americans included in the game are kind of meant to establish things for Arthur in his characterization rather than for the Native Americans. I mean, it has these moments in the last quarter of the game where you're kind of building up to this climax in which Arthur stands against Dutch and Micah, right? And so it is a way, especially if you're playing as an honorable character, is a way to build up that honor, right? To kind of help the natives with their plight. And then also, I mean, I think there's an obvious parallel, which Dutch brings up many times, Charles brings up, Arthur brings up, of this idea that really the gang and the natives are on the same side of the coin, right? That they
Yeah.
are both
Yeah.
kind of victims of this
Mm.
closing of the frontier of this land that no longer needs them.
Yeah.
Which, to compare the plight of the gang, a gang of outlaws, to the plight of Native Americans is really kind of disgusting.
Yeah.
Conversely, I mean, with all of these things, and you've kind of alluded to it too, with whether it's with the role of women, whether it's the role of African Americans, racism, Native Americans, I suppose it's good that at least they made the effort. But I kind of wonder, was it the best effort they could have
Yeah.
made? Was it the minimum kind of cover your ass effort? I haven't really decided yet, but I do think that out of these three, the issues related to Native Americans, the representation of Native Americans is, I think, maybe the worst out of all of them.
Yeah. No, I totally agree that, essentially conflating the struggles of white Americans who choose to be on the wrong side of the law with Native American, this very, comparatively small group of Native Americans, without really even touching the kind of historical issues, the awful things that were done, this history of essentially ethnic cleansing. They obviously, but like, this is what I was saying in terms of, they just assume that people know this, and I don't think everyone knows this. Like, it seems as though it's a taken for granted statement of fact that not all Americans even are actually really aware of or care about.
Yes.
And I think
it's the whole reason why History Respawned exists.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But I find it really problematic that it leans into these sort of really kind of distasteful stereotypes, especially the sort of the noble savage kind of thing. I was writing something up on this the other day, and especially with Dutch and the way his character behaves and his kind of character arc. I was thinking about Philip Deloria's The Idea of Playing Indian.
Yes, excellent book. Yeah.
Yeah, whereby white Americans kind of try and negotiate their identity by way of Native Americans and the kind of appropriation and misappropriation of that. And especially near the end, it just leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. It's, on the one hand, it's this idea that when civilized, quote unquote, civilized society no longer needs him, he turns to this quote unquote uncivilized society. So, and it's kind of in this double bind of when he's portrayed by all the gang members as losing control and becoming paranoid and becoming more bloodthirsty and becoming essentially more savage, he joins up with this kind of noble cause, which, or what he sees as this noble cause of the Native Americans being dispossessed and disenfranchised. But at the same time, you have these entire missions where he's like, oh, I'm just trying to stir up, trouble between the army and Native Americans, and they'll blame it on the Indian problem, and then we can escape to New York and then go to some like Tahiti or something. It's like, it just, what they could have done to kind of correct what the first game did, with just putting Dutch in with the Native Americans is like this really weird, like, well, I can't understand, did you only do that just so you could cover your back and have some Native Americans? They really, really didn't try and correct it. They just leaned in hard to these sort of really problematic issues. And I think when I was listening to the Waypoint 101's thing on Red Dead Redemption that they did, the podcast they did a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was Rob Zachney on that, and he sort of said something that really kind of struck me. I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly how I feel. And he said that it feels like sometimes Rockstar Games don't understand the references they're making well enough to critique them. And I thought that was just like, it really kind of summed up a lot. The writers, they think that they obviously understand these things, and they obviously understand that yes, they are bad, but these things are not just kind of these easy moral disengagement factors that you can put out there and then like everyone will agree with you this is bad and they will understand this is bad. It's such surface level engagement that kind of consciously or unconsciously then ends up really holding up these really bad sort of tropes that have foundations in racism.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's try to wrap up here by talking about the ways in which Red Dead Redemption 2 leans into realism, particularly with regard to game mechanics. In this game, the player is responsible for managing Arthur, his sleep cycle, his eating habits. In addition, you have to kind of do the same thing for your horse. And, whenever Arthur is walking around, you get a real sense of his physicality, perhaps more so than any other game I've played, where you've got hundreds and hundreds of different animations to express when he's leaning over, when he's, brushing his horse, when he's taking a swig of whiskey. And I'm just wondering, what do you think of this move towards more realistic mechanics, more kind of realistic animations? Do you think that this approach is successful?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually. When I was sort of starting out with it, and experience and feeling these animations, feeling you do get a sense of like Arthur's heft when you are moving. It really reminded me of, I don't know if you played it, a Firewatch, where I know that one of the things they intended was that you kind of moved and felt like you were moving as like a middle-aged man, on a much smaller scale. But I think it had an interesting feel to it. And I mean, I don't dislike the fact that they put this energy into doing that. It was kind of it was frustrating, the fact that I powered through this game as quickly as I could to get to the end with the intention that I would go back and restart it, and I found that it was frustrating in that sense. So I do think it's interesting that the game is basically engineered to slow you down. And now that I've started it again and I'm re-exploring places and I'm just doing it at a more sedate pace, I am kind of enjoying the experience of it a bit more, because I'm not studying it. I'm not trying to get through it really quick. But I think especially in reviews that I've read, and I think this realism discourse is really problematic when we're talking about video games. Like using the term authenticity, it kind of works like this, intentional or not, this ideological cloak. And I get that, this is the realism, is the effort in creating realism is put into certain areas as opposed to with others, as obviously we've been talking about. And I think essentially that it makes this game that revolves around spectacle and is essentially built from the details up. It's meant to be very sensual. It's meant to be very kind of atmospheric and experiential, but it kind of feels skin deep at the same time. So I'm not opposed to it. It also kind of reminded me, I think, of the way Geralt moves in The Witcher 3. I felt like that was a kind of another sort of similar game that I was judging this by the standards of, but I don't know what it adds to the historical world. I get what it adds in terms of details and gameplay, but it feels like that was essentially privileged over putting the effort into making this realistic in other ways.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, what I've noticed in listening to a lot of podcasts about this from other game critics, reading articles, is that so many of them say, this is journalists here, so many of them say like, oh, well, this deliberateness to the mechanics is so great because it's so real to the time period, right? That it harkens back to what life was like, how slow life was in the late 19th century. And I'm sitting here just kind of rolling my eyes. It's like, well, all of this time that we could have taken in, developing a richer, more nuanced narrative, we spent in, getting great animations for brushing your horse, right?
Yeah.
I totally agree. I feel like maybe some of those efforts, maybe some of those, that graphical work could have been spent on kind of more developed narratives. And I'm wondering, because the Hausers, especially Dan Hauser, are so intimately involved in the narrative side of things rather than the developmental side. I'm wondering if, perhaps they felt as though they didn't really need an editor for the writing, whereas with the kind of graphical side, they have felt free to kind of be very precise and editorial over those elements. I don't know. Obviously not many people have a window into how Rockstar Games actually operates, but I'm absolutely fascinated to kind of learn more about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess my only window into talking about Rockstar and what they do is looking at these public discourses that surround their games. But yeah, I do spend a lot of time kind of thinking about this and writing about this, especially the writing process. And it almost, I feel with a lot of most of the games actually, there's this not a sort of like fatal disconnect, but there's a huge disconnect between story and gameplay.
Yes.
In the sense that the story is obviously trying to do very sort of big, grandiose things, but actually, and Rockstar are known for their stories. We can't say that they're not, but what they essentially are also known for is their gameplay. And there's this conflict between wanting to give people like the illusion of choice and the illusion of like doing whatever you want, and these promotional discourses that like you are completely free to do whatever you want, but they also, you are really constricted to passing through this very linear story that is very linear and does not actually allow for much room for nuance or for experiencing things in other ways.
Yeah. And not just narratively, but also mechanically, right? I mean, there is a set path to finishing the mission. And if you kind of stray from those set paths, mechanically speaking, then you are going to fail. And then there's also, of course, the medal system in which you're rewarded for playing it in kind of a certain way. So I definitely agree.
Yeah, it's like the illusion, this illusion of kind of freedom is completely constrained by what it is you are told to do implicitly or explicitly. And yeah, I mean, I feel like we should probably mention as well this whole thing of when we're talking about engineering the mechanics and the actual experience of the game, we should probably at least mention sort of this whole controversy about the kind of the crunch and the overtime. And I find it really interesting that obviously there seems to be this kind of culture of overtime and of making the game offer something very specific, and doing that off the backs of probably hundreds of people all over the world in this kind of crunch mode. But like you said, the story is written by Dan Houser and and a couple of other people. It's this very small, close-knit writing team that is communicating a very specific thing and is not kind of subject to editorial or outside influence. I find that a really interesting, let's say, sort of dichotomy, I guess.
I think that does it for our episode of History Respawned. Esther, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of History Respawned, please check out our website at www.historyrespawned.com. And if you're interested in supporting our work, please visit our page on Patreon at www.patreon.com/historyrespawned. Until next time, goodbye.